It was a calm evening when Judge Taylor, a highly respected black woman, was driving home after another long day at court. She had just presided over a series of cases, making tough decisions and ensuring justice was served. Known for her intelligence and fairness, Judge Taylor was a trailblazer in the legal field. She had worked hard to get where she was, facing many obstacles and challenges as a woman of color in a male-dominated profession. But despite the struggles, she had earned her place among the most respected judges in the state. As she drove through the quiet streets, she looked out at the city she had spent years serving. Everything seemed normal. The sun had just set, casting a soft glow over the buildings, and the streets were starting to clear as people wrapped up their days. She was looking forward to a peaceful evening at home. But as she turned a corner, her car was suddenly flooded with bright flashing lights. A police officer had pulled her over. Judge Taylor wasn't worried. She had been pulled over before, like any other driver. But as she rolled down the window and glanced at the officer, she immediately felt something was different this time. The officer, a young white man, had an expression on his face that seemed to suggest he was expecting trouble. His posture was tense, and his hand hovered near his gun as he approached the car. It wasn't the usual calm and professional behavior she had experienced with most officers in the past. "Good evening, ma'am," the officer said, his voice stiff. "I pulled you over because you were driving a little too fast through that last intersection." Judge Taylor didn't respond right away. She stayed calm and took a deep breath, preparing herself for what was about to unfold. She wasn't a person to argue, especially not with a police officer. But there was something about the officer's tone that didn't sit right with her. She had been driving at a safe speed, and the last thing she expected was to be stopped for something as minor as that. She gave a small nod and handed him her license and registration. "I'm sorry, officer, but I don't believe I was speeding," she said, her voice steady and calm. She didn't want to escalate the situation, but she also wasn't going to let him treat her like she was guilty of something she hadn't done. The officer took the documents from her, but instead of immediately checking them or telling her to be on her way, he just stood there for a moment. There was a strange pause, and she could see the officer looking her up and down, sizing her up. His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, almost as if he was unsure of what he was seeing. After a few seconds, he cleared his throat and looked at her again. "You know," he said, his voice a little less professional now, "I don't see many people like you around here. What are you doing in this neighborhood?" The question caught Judge Taylor off guard. She had been driving through this neighborhood for years. It wasn't just a random place. It was part of her daily route. She knew the streets well, and had many friends and colleagues who lived in the area. But the way the officer had asked the question, it felt loaded with judgment. "The people like you" comment hung in the air like an accusation. Judge Taylor took a moment to process his words. She knew exactly what he meant. The officer didn't believe someone like her, a black woman, belonged in this part of town. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't just a poorly worded question. It was clear. The officer was making an assumption based on her race. Her mind raced for a moment. Should she confront him directly? Should she stay quiet and let him continue with his line of questioning? She could feel the tension building, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she kept her expression calm and her tone even, despite the sting of his words. "I live here," she replied, her voice unwavering. She wasn't going to let him continue down this path. She wasn't going to let him make her feel like she was out of place. The officer seemed a little thrown off by her response, but he quickly recovered. "All right," he said, though his tone now seemed less confident. "I'm just going to check your information, and I'll be right back." As he walked back to his patrol car, Judge Taylor sat there in silence, processing the encounter. She wasn't surprised by his behavior. Sadly, she was used to it. It was something she had dealt with all her life, a constant reminder that racism didn't disappear just because she had achieved success. But this was different. This wasn't just an ordinary traffic stop. There was something about this officer's attitude that made it clear he had already decided who she was, and he was making his assumptions based on nothing more than the color of her skin. Her mind was already working, thinking about what to do next. Should she call for backup? Should she let this go? The officer's behavior had crossed a line, but Judge Taylor wasn't someone to act rashly. She would wait and see how this played out, but she knew one thing for sure: this wasn't going to end quietly. As the officer returned to his patrol car, Judge Taylor sat quietly in her vehicle, her thoughts racing. She knew she needed to stay calm. It was important not to let the situation escalate any further, but deep down, she was upset. She had been pulled over for no good reason, other than the officer's own assumptions about her based on her race. It wasn't just annoying. It was wrong. She had been treated like a suspect when all she was doing was driving home, like anyone else. But in that moment, she reminded herself that her reaction could shape the outcome. The officer's footsteps echoed as he walked back toward her car. She could see his shadow growing larger through the side mirror. He was holding her license and registration in his hand, but his expression had changed. Now, there was a noticeable nervousness in his posture. He seemed unsure, like he didn't quite know how to handle the situation anymore. The confidence he had shown when he first approached her had disappeared. When he reached her window, he didn't say anything right away. Instead, he stood there for a moment, glancing down at her documents in his hands. It was almost as if he was looking for something to give him a reason to keep the conversation going, a reason to make her feel guilty or out of place. But Judge Taylor wasn't playing into it. She kept her eyes focused straight ahead, her hands resting calmly on the steering wheel. She wasn't going to make it easy for him. Finally, the officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for the confusion earlier. I didn't realize who you were." He shuffled a bit, clearly uncomfortable. "You're the judge, aren't you?" Judge Taylor didn't immediately respond. She wasn't going to let his apology or shift in tone make her forget the real issue. She had worked hard to get where she was. But in that moment, she couldn't help but feel the sting of his earlier comment. To him, she was just another person of color that didn't belong in a place like this. His apology didn't fix that. "Yes, I am," she said slowly, her voice measured but firm. "But that's not the point." The officer's face flushed red, and he seemed to stumble over his next words. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to offend you. It's just that, well, sometimes people aren't used to seeing someone like you around here." Judge Taylor let the words hang in the air for a moment. She knew what he was saying without needing him to explain. What he meant was that people like her, black people, weren't supposed to be in certain neighborhoods. To him, she didn't fit the image of someone who belonged in this area, someone who was successful or powerful. It was a harsh reminder of how deeply ingrained racism could be, even in those who were supposed to protect and serve the community. Her hands tightened slightly around the steering wheel, but she refused to let her anger show. She was a judge for a reason. She had learned how to stay composed, how to think before reacting. She needed to make this officer understand that his behavior was unacceptable, that no one should be treated this way, no matter who they were. "Let's be clear," she began, her voice calm but stern. "It doesn't matter who I am or where I live. You don't have the right to stop me just because of how I look. You don't get to decide whether I belong here." The officer shifted uneasily. He was trying to find something to say, but the words seemed to escape him. Judge Taylor could see the struggle in his eyes. He had made a serious mistake, and now he didn't know how to take it back. "I'm just doing my job," he mumbled, almost as if he was trying to convince himself. "I thought I saw something suspicious. I didn't mean any harm." Judge Taylor didn't believe him. This wasn't about doing his job. It was about his assumptions, his beliefs that people of color didn't belong in certain places, that they were more likely to be trouble. That was the real reason he'd stopped her. She had heard this line of thinking too many times before. "This isn't about suspicion," she replied. "This is about race. You decided I was out of place, and that's why you stopped me. You didn't give me a chance." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Judge Taylor cut him off. "I don't want an apology, officer. I want you to understand that what you did was wrong. People like you, officers like you, are supposed to protect and serve everyone equally, not just the people you think belong." The officer seemed to shrink under her words. He looked down at his feet, embarrassed. Judge Taylor could see he wasn't used to being confronted like this, especially not by someone in her position. He had expected her to just accept his behavior and move on, but she wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. She wasn't going to let him get away with his racism. She took a deep breath and leaned slightly forward. "I'm going to make sure this gets reported. It's not just about me. It's about every person you've treated like this. You need to be held accountable." The officer finally nodded, his face a mixture of guilt and frustration. "I understand, Mom." As he turned to walk back to his car again, Judge Taylor sat there for a moment, her mind still racing. She had done what she needed to do. She had spoken up, but she wasn't done yet. This wasn't going to end with a simple apology. She was going to make sure that the officer and the department understood that behavior like this couldn't be ignored. For now, though, she would wait and see how far this would go. The officer returned to his patrol car, looking over his shoulder at Judge Taylor as he walked. He was trying to collect himself, but the unease in his step was obvious. It was clear he wasn't sure what to expect next. Judge Taylor sat in her car, hands still gripping the steering wheel. She could hear the sound of the officer's footsteps fading away as he reached his vehicle, but she didn't feel any relief. In fact, the silence made her more alert, her thoughts still running through her mind. What was going to happen now? The officer knew who she was, but that didn't mean he understood the seriousness of his actions. He might have thought that just apologizing would make everything go away. But Judge Taylor wasn't the kind of person who would let someone get off that easily. His behavior wasn't just a mistake. It was a sign of something much deeper: racial prejudice. She glanced at the rearview mirror and caught sight of the officer sitting in his car, writing something down. He wasn't looking back at her, but she knew he was probably trying to figure out what to do next. Was he about to just let her go, or was he going to try something else? Judge Taylor didn't know, but she was ready for whatever came next. A few minutes passed before the officer finally got out of his car again. This time, he walked back to her window with a different energy. Gone was the initial confidence he had shown when he first stopped her. Now, he seemed more cautious, maybe even a little afraid. Judge Taylor noticed the change right away. He wasn't acting like the same officer who had approached her so arrogantly earlier. When he reached her window, he stood there for a moment, looking at her with a mix of guilt and uncertainty. He didn't speak right away, and Judge Taylor wasn't in a hurry to say anything either. The silence between them felt heavy, but she wasn't about to break it first. She knew she had all the time in the world to make her point clear. Finally, the officer cleared his throat and handed her back her license and registration. "I've checked your information, and everything seems in order," he said, his voice lacking the earlier bravado. "I apologize for the misunderstanding, ma'am. I didn't know who you were, and I shouldn't have made those assumptions." Judge Taylor took a deep breath. The apology was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't enough. He had made her feel like she didn't belong, and no apology could take away that sting. The worst part was that he didn't even seem to fully understand the impact of his actions. He wasn't just sorry because he had wrongly accused her. He was sorry because he had gotten caught. He wasn't thinking about the bigger picture, the way his behavior could hurt someone like her, or anyone else who faced the same kind of treatment. "You didn't just make a mistake," Judge Taylor replied calmly, but with firm conviction. "You assumed that I didn't belong here. You thought I was out of place because of the way I look. That's not a simple misunderstanding. It's a pattern." The officer shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the ground. Judge Taylor could see he was struggling with her words. She wasn't trying to make him feel bad. She was trying to make him understand. It wasn't just about her. It was about how his actions could affect others, how his prejudices could affect entire communities. He was supposed to be someone who helped keep the peace, But instead, he had let his biases take over. "I didn't mean to," the officer began, but Judge Taylor stopped him. "You didn't mean to, but you did," she said, her voice steady. "And that's why it matters. If this happens to one person, it can happen to anyone. And it has to stop." The officer looked up at her, his face a mix of frustration and recognition. He couldn't deny that what she was saying made sense. For the first time in their conversation, he seemed to be thinking about things from her perspective, really hearing the weight of her words. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'll report this. I'll make sure I get this on record." Judge Taylor nodded, but she wasn't finished. "It's not just about reporting it. It's about making sure you change your actions in the future. No one should be treated like I was tonight. You need to understand that, and you need to act on it." The officer's face tightened, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded. "I will." There was a pause, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Judge Taylor felt her heart pounding in her chest. She had done what she could for now, but she knew this wouldn't be the end of the conversation. There were bigger issues at play, and she wasn't going to let them slide just because the officer had apologized. This wasn't a small matter. It was a problem that affected far too many people. The officer turned to leave, walking back toward his patrol car without saying anything more. Judge Taylor watched him go, her mind still working. She wasn't sure if anything would change, but she had made sure that her voice was heard. And that was all she could do for now. As the officer drove away, Judge Taylor started her car and pulled back onto the road. Her journey home felt different now, heavier, somehow. The evening had started as any other, but now it had become something more. It was a reminder of the work that still needed to be done, the battle against racism that wasn't over just because one officer had apologized. Judge Taylor knew this was just one small moment in a much bigger fight, and she was ready for whatever came next. As Judge Taylor drove away from the traffic stop, she couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter wasn't over. Though the officer had apologized and promised to report the incident, she knew that wasn't enough. She had to make sure that his actions didn't just go unnoticed or dismissed. The situation had been serious, and it was crucial that something more came from it. She wasn't just going to let it slide. The streets were quiet as she drove, but her mind was racing. She thought about the officer's words, about how he had been quick to assume that she didn't belong in that area. That assumption wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger problem. Racial profiling, bias, and inequality had been issues she had seen her whole life, both in and out of the courtroom. This officer's actions weren't unique. They were symptoms of a much bigger issue, and she wasn't going to let him or anyone else think that this was something that could be swept under the rug. By the time she reached her home, Judge Taylor had already made up her mind. She knew what she had to do. She grabbed her phone and dialed the number of her colleague, someone she trusted in law enforcement who had always been an ally when it came to racial justice issues. After a few rings, the voice on the other end picked up. "Judge Taylor, what's going on?" her colleague asked, clearly sensing something was up. "I need your help," she replied, her voice steady but serious. "I had an incident tonight with one of your officers, and it needs to be addressed." She explained what had happened during the traffic stop, how the officer had pulled her over without any real reason, how he had made assumptions about her based on her race, and how he had treated her like she didn't belong in the neighborhood. The more she spoke, the more her anger built. It wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been made to feel out of place because of the color of their skin. It wasn't just one officer. It was part of a larger system that allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked. "I understand," her colleague said after hearing her side. "This is exactly the kind of thing we've been trying to address. I'll make sure it gets reported, and that the department takes this seriously. But Judge, you need to be prepared. This won't be easy. It's going to be a long process." "I'm ready," she said without hesitation. "This can't keep happening. Not to me, and not to anyone else." After they hung up, Judge Taylor felt a sense of resolve. She knew she was taking on something bigger than just one officer. She was stepping into a system that had long ignored or justified behavior like this. But she was also determined to make sure that things change. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been treated unjustly, for everyone who had been overlooked because of their race. The next few days passed quickly. Judge Taylor's phone rang with updates from her colleague. He had already reached out to the police department, and they had opened an internal review into the officer's conduct. She also got a call from the officer's superior, who expressed concern over the incident. Judge Taylor had made it clear that she wasn't just going to let it go, and now the department was starting to take her seriously. However, Judge Taylor wasn't satisfied yet. She wasn't going to let this just be another report that got filed away. She knew that without more pressure, nothing would change. So she decided to take a more direct approach. She called a meeting with the chief of police. When she walked into the meeting, the room was quiet. The chief of police, along with a few other senior officers, sat at the table waiting for her. They all knew why she was there, and none of them seemed particularly happy about it. But Judge Taylor wasn't intimidated. She had spent years sitting in courtrooms, standing up for what was right. She wasn't about to back down now. "Thank you for meeting with me," she began, her voice strong and clear. "I'm here because something has to change. What happened to me isn't an isolated incident. This is part of a larger problem that needs to be addressed, not just with one officer, but with the entire department." The officers around the table exchanged uncomfortable glances, but Judge Taylor didn't let them avoid the issue. She laid out the facts of what had happened, how the officer had assumed she didn't belong in that neighborhood, and how his actions reflected a deeper problem of racial bias in the police force. "We have a responsibility to serve and protect every member of the community, regardless of their race, gender, or background," she continued. "But what happened to me shows that there is work to be done to ensure that happens. If we don't address this now, things will continue to get worse." The room was silent for a few moments, and Judge Taylor could see that her words were having an impact. The chief of police, who had been listening carefully, finally spoke up. "You're right," he said, his voice steady. "We can't ignore this. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again, not just with your case, but with every officer in this department." Judge Taylor nodded. "It's not enough to just acknowledge the problem. We need real change. We need training, accountability, and transparency. We need to show the community that we are committed to treating everyone equally." The meeting lasted for nearly an hour, and Judge Taylor made it clear that she wasn't leaving until something concrete was put in place. By the end of the discussion, the department had agreed to implement new training programs aimed at addressing racial bias and improving community relations. As Judge Taylor left the meeting, she felt a sense of accomplishment. This wasn't over yet, but it was a start. She had pushed the department to take responsibility, and now it was time to hold them accountable for the changes they had promised. She was making a difference, and though the road ahead would be long, she was ready for whatever came next. The days after the meeting with the police chief were tense, but Judge Taylor felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had made it clear to the department that things needed to change, and now she was waiting to see if they would follow through. Her phone buzzed constantly with updates, but despite the promises made, she knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. One afternoon, she received a call from her colleague in the police department. He had some news. The officer involved in her traffic stop had been placed on leave while the internal investigation was being conducted. It was a small victory, but it was a step in the right direction. However, Judge Taylor wasn't going to let her guard down just yet. The officer may be on leave, but that didn't guarantee the department was going to make meaningful changes. She knew she had to keep the pressure on. Over the next few weeks, she kept in contact with her colleague, checking in on the progress of the investigation. But the more she heard, the more frustrated she became. It seemed like the department was dragging its feet. While they had made promises to improve training and accountability, nothing had been implemented yet. The investigation into the officer's actions was moving at a glacial pace. Judge Taylor couldn't help but feel that they were hoping the whole situation would blow over on its own. She couldn't let that happen. She wasn't the kind of person who would sit back and wait. So Judge Taylor decided to take things into her own hands. She called a press conference. The decision wasn't an easy one. She knew that by going public, she would be putting herself under a lot of scrutiny. She would be opening up the possibility of backlash from those who didn't understand or agree with her stance. But she also knew that the only way to bring about real change was to keep the issue in the public eye, to make sure the department knew that people were watching and that they couldn't just hide behind empty promises. When the day of the press conference arrived, Judge Taylor stood at the podium, facing a room full of reporters with cameras flashing. She was calm, but her heart was racing. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been affected by racism and bias. It was about making sure that the police department understood that they couldn't continue to treat people of color like they didn't matter. "I'm here today because of what happened to me during a traffic stop several weeks ago," she began, her voice steady and strong. "But this isn't just about me. It's about the larger problem of racial profiling and bias in our police force. It's about how these issues affect entire communities, how they make people feel unsafe and unheard." She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle. The room was silent, all eyes on her. "The officer who pulled me over made assumptions about me based on my race, and while that incident may have seemed small to some, it's part of a much bigger problem that needs to be addressed. If we don't confront this now, it will keep happening. And I'm not willing to let that happen anymore." The reporters were eager, firing off questions one after another. Judge Taylor answered them all with poise and confidence, explaining the importance of holding the police accountable and demanding change. She didn't hold back. She talked about the need for better training to address racial bias, the importance of community engagement, and the role of the police in protecting and serving everyone equally. "This isn't about attacking the police," she said firmly. "This is about demanding accountability, about ensuring that every citizen, no matter their race, feels safe and respected. We can't fix what we don't acknowledge, and I'm here to make sure that the department acknowledges this problem." The press conference was over in less than an hour, but its impact was immediate. News outlets picked up the story, and the conversation spread across social media. People were talking about Judge Taylor's bravery, about her decision to stand up not just for herself, but for everyone who had been unfairly targeted by law enforcement. Many expressed their support, while others questioned her actions. But for Judge Taylor, it didn't matter what the critics said. She was doing what she knew was right. The next day, she received a call from the police chief. He was less than pleased with how things had unfolded. He told her that the department was being bombarded with calls and media inquiries, and that the pressure was building. He expressed frustration that she had gone public with the issue before giving the department more time to handle it internally. "I understand your concerns, Judge," he said, his voice tense. "But we need to have a private conversation about how to proceed. This is a complicated issue." "I'm not here to have a private conversation," Judge Taylor replied, her voice firm. "I'm here to make sure that change happens. The time for private conversations is over. If you truly care about fixing this, you'll start listening to the people, not just worrying about your department's image." The call ended, and Judge Taylor felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. She knew she had just set the wheels in motion for something bigger, something that couldn't be ignored. The department was now under intense public scrutiny, and they would have to act. She had done what she needed to do. She had forced the issue into the spotlight. As she hung up the phone, Judge Taylor allowed herself a moment to reflect. She had taken a risk, but it was a risk worth taking. Change wasn't easy, and it wasn't always quick, but it was possible, and she was going to keep pushing until she saw it happen. The days following the press conference were intense. Judge Taylor's decision to go public had stirred up a storm. News outlets were still covering the story, and social media was flooded with opinions. Some people applauded her courage, while others criticized her for going against the police. But for Judge Taylor, The mixed reactions didn't matter. She had started a conversation that needed to happen, and now it was time to see if real change could come from it. As the pressure on the police department continued to grow, Judge Taylor received regular updates from her colleague in law enforcement. The internal investigation into the officer who had stopped her was moving forward, but slowly. The department had promised to take the issue seriously, but it was clear that they didn't want to make any rash decisions without looking into all the facts. Still, Judge Taylor wasn't satisfied. She wasn't going to let them take their time and hope that people would forget. One afternoon, Judge Taylor met with a group of community leaders. They had reached out to her after the press conference, expressing their support for what she was doing. They knew that this issue was bigger than just one officer or one traffic stop. It was about the long-standing problem of racial profiling and discrimination within law enforcement. The group included activists, lawyers, and people from all walks of life who had experienced unfair treatment by the police. "I'm glad you all reached out," Judge Taylor said as she took a seat at the table. "This isn't something that I can do alone. We need to come together and make sure that the department knows we're watching." "We're with you, Judge," one of the activists, a young woman named Sarah, said. "But we can't just wait for them to make changes. We need to keep pushing. We need to demand accountability, not just from one officer, but from the entire department." Judge Taylor nodded. She had already made it clear to the police chief that the changes couldn't be delayed any longer, but she knew that real change would require constant pressure. The department had promised reforms, but promises were easy to make. Following through was the hard part. "We need to be organized," Judge Taylor said. "We need to keep the conversation going. We can't let them sweep this under the rug. If we want change, we have to be persistent." Over the next few weeks, the group organized protests, rallies, and meetings with local government officials. They raised awareness in the community about the problems with the police department and pushed for policy changes. Judge Taylor was at the center of it all, her leadership and determination inspiring others to take action. She knew that this wasn't going to be a quick fight, but she was committed to seeing it through. As the weeks passed, the pressure on the police department intensified. The public scrutiny wasn't just focused on the officer who had stopped Judge Taylor, it was focused on the entire department. People were calling for changes in how the police handled racial bias, how they interacted with communities of color, and how they were held accountable for their actions. The police department, faced with mounting public pressure, began to take more concrete steps. They announced new training programs for officers, focused on de-escalation, bias recognition, and community engagement. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The department also promised to review its policies on racial profiling and to be more transparent about their disciplinary actions. For Judge Taylor, it was a small victory, but it wasn't enough. She knew that the real test would be whether these changes would stick, whether they would actually make a difference in how officers treated people of color. The training and new policies were important, but the culture of the department needed to change as well. She was determined to make sure that the department didn't just go through the motions and then forget about the problem. One evening, she received a call from the police chief. He wanted to meet with her to discuss the progress they had made. Judge Taylor agreed, but she wasn't going to let him off easy. She needed to make sure that the department was committed to lasting change, not just short-term fixes. When they met, the chief began by outlining the steps the department had taken in response to the public outcry. They had set up mandatory training sessions for all officers, and they had established a community advisory board to oversee police practices. He told her that they were committed to addressing the issue of racial profiling and that they were working on improving their relationship with the community. "I'm glad to hear that," Judge Taylor said, her voice calm but firm. "But I need to be clear, this is just the beginning. The department needs to be held accountable for its actions, not just in words, but in practice. The community needs to see that these changes are real and that they're making a difference." The chief nodded. "I understand, Judge. We know this is a long-term commitment. "We're not just making changes for the sake of appearances. We want to rebuild trust with the community." Judge Taylor didn't doubt the chief's sincerity, but she wasn't ready to just take his word for it. She knew that the department's actions would speak louder than their promises. She would continue to hold them accountable, making sure that they followed through on their commitments. As the meeting came to an end, Judge Taylor stood up and extended her hand. "I'll be watching. We'll all be watching. And we'll keep pushing until we see real change." The chief shook her hand, and as she walked out of the room, she felt a sense of determination. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time, she felt like the department was starting to take the issue seriously. This fight wasn't over, but it had shifted in her favor, and as she had breath in her body, she would continue to push for the justice that was long overdue. Months passed since Judge Taylor's bold decision to speak out against the police officers' actions, and the changes in the police department, though gradual, were starting to show. The pressure from the community, along with the media attention, had forced the department to take more meaningful steps toward reform. There were still challenges, but Judge Taylor couldn't ignore the fact that the conversation had shifted. Racial profiling and police bias were finally being addressed in ways they hadn't been before. Judge Taylor knew that real change took time, and she was in it for the long haul. She had seen small improvements, new policies were being implemented, and officers were undergoing regular training on racial bias and de-escalation. But even with these changes, she didn't believe the job was finished. She wasn't the type to back down when there was still work to be done, and she was committed to ensuring that these reforms would be lasting, and not just for show. One day, Judge Taylor was invited to speak at a community forum organized by a local nonprofit. The forum was designed to give the public a chance to voice their concerns about policing and racial injustice. It was an opportunity for citizens to talk directly with local leaders, law enforcement officials, and community advocates. Judge Taylor agreed to attend, knowing that the event could help amplify the voices of those who had been affected by police misconduct. When she arrived at the venue, the atmosphere was tense but hopeful. The room was filled with a diverse group of people, some eager to share their stories, others sitting quietly, waiting to hear what the leaders had to say. Judge Taylor walked to the front of the room, greeted by a round of applause. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about the future of her community and the hope that change could be made. As she began to speak, she focused not just on her own experience, but on the broader issue of systemic racism and the need for long-term solutions. "We can no longer accept a world where people are treated unfairly based on their skin color," she said, her voice steady and strong. "The events of the past few months have shown me that our community has the power to create change, but that change requires all of us, police officers, community leaders, activists, and residents alike, working together." The crowd listened attentively, many nodding in agreement. Judge Taylor continued, explaining the importance of building trust between the police and the community. She talked about the need for transparency and how officers were held accountable, and the importance of ongoing education to break down racial biases. It wasn't enough to simply pass new policies or offer occasional training sessions. The police department needed to commit to constant self-reflection and improvement. But Judge Taylor also made sure to remind the crowd that their role in creating change was just as important. "We must continue to hold the department accountable," she said. "We must push for reforms, but we must also be a part of the solution. Change doesn't just come from the top down. It comes from all of us standing together and demanding a better future." Her words resonated with the audience, and as she finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. It was clear that her message had struck a chord. The forum continued with open discussions, and Judge Taylor listened as people shared their experiences, stories of discrimination, fear, and hope. Many were inspired by the progress she had already helped bring about, but they also made it clear that they weren't going to stop pushing until real, lasting change was achieved. As the event came to a close, Judge Taylor spoke to several members of the community, who approached her to express their gratitude. They thanked her for speaking up and for being a voice for justice. She smiled and shook their hands, feeling a deep sense of pride in the work that had been done and the work still to come. Later that evening, she sat down to reflect on the day. It was clear that the road ahead was still long, but the progress made so far gave her hope. She had helped shine a light on the deep-rooted issues of racial bias and police misconduct, and while there was still much work to be done, Judge Taylor knew that the momentum for change was real. The officer who had stopped her that day was still under investigation, and Judge Taylor had been informed that his case was nearing its final stages. She hoped that the outcome would send a clear message that no one, regardless of their position, was above the law. But even more than that, she hoped that the department would continue to embrace the changes that had begun. She wanted to see a police force that truly reflected the values of justice, equality, and respect for every community member. That night, as she prepared for bed, Judge Taylor thought about how far she had come. A few months ago, she had been a victim of injustice, a simple traffic stop that had escalated because of racial profiling. But now, she was part of something bigger. She was part of a movement, a collective effort to make the world a fairer, safer place for everyone. She knew the fight wasn't over, but she also knew that the spark she had helped ignite was growing. And as she drifted off to sleep, Judge Taylor promised herself that she would never stop fighting for the justice that every person, regardless of their race, deserved.